Good morning and welcome to our third in a series on COVID work disruption. We are delighted you're here, and I'm delighted to welcome Chip Roper. I'm Missy Wallace, and I work for City to Cities Global Faith and Work Initiative. And you'll see on your screen a survey coming up. We'd really like to understand who all is in the room or the Zoom with us today. So if you don't mind taking a moment to answer the question before you on your screen. And today we are here to continue to talk about work disruption. Many of you have joined us on our other webinars. Our first webinar really reviewed a model to help think about work disruption and to think about the patterns in work disruption and how the gospel can help with particular types of work disruption. We have some people with dramatically more work, some people with dramatically less work, and people at varying starting points with socioeconomic flexibility. And all these lead to varying spiritual needs and physical needs that lead to the hope of the gospel perhaps being communicated in different ways and leading to outward love towards others. That was our first seminar, and those slides are available on our website. Our second seminar was the way that the local church could practically engage the job disruption. And today, I'm so delighted to have Chip Roper join us. And Chip will be helping us understand how can we help the individual? How can we help individuals think about calling when they feel incredibly disrupted? And what are the anchors of calling? And with record unemployment, over 20% unemployment, some are saying, close to the depression rates of 24%. We are going to have, as the church, capital C, as well as church individual organizations, more people unemployed than we have seen probably in most of our lives. How can we as the church talk about it? How can we talk about it corporately? How can we talk about it as individuals? And so I'm delighted to have Chip here. Chip comes to us with more than 2 decades as a church planter and a senior pastor, as well as almost a decade running a small business, as well as now being a certified career coach and starting and leading a nonprofit dedicated to help people rethink their work, whether they like their work or not, whether it's work that's their passion or work that's their requirement, how you think about it and how you think about it when you need to find new work. And so, Chip, before we get going, it's interesting. It looks like today, usually on these calls, we've tended to have more church professionals than marketplace professionals. Looks like today we have a flip. So we have about 15% pastors on the call, another 24% other nonprofit employees, and then 18% corporate employees. And today, this is the highest unemployed group we've had. 20% of people on this call are unemployed. So we're particularly happy you're here. We know you are unemployed or furloughed people might be the most anxious people on the call. So we're delighted to have you with us. At the end, we'll share with you where you can get some of the resources that Chip will be talking about, as well as email them to you later today. And so with that, I turn it over to you, Chip.
Well, it's great to be here with everybody. And Missy, thanks for having me. Based on my bio, I think my primary qualification to be here is that I'm vocationally confused because I've done just about everything. But we're going to walk through a process this morning, at least it's this morning here in New York, and talk a bit about how a sense of vocational calling can anchor us through this COVID moment. I think the thing that we all share in common is our work has changed in the last 2 months. Everybody, like almost everybody in the whole world, our work is, some dynamic of our work has changed. And it's kind of amazing to be part, and we're just sharing this experience, and it's changed in lots of different directions. So kind of the practical question that we want to get out together this today is, what can we hold on to? And many of us, or probably most of us, are believers. We say, well, hold on to God. But what does God give us to hold on to from Him? And I'd say the short answer, He gives us a sense of vocation, a sense of calling that can provide us an anchor through this storm, so to speak. So we're going to unpack that today in 3 kind of parts. And the first is just to define kind of what calling is, and um, see if I can get my slideshow to advance. There we go. The first idea is that having a sense of robust sense of calling does provide us with the flexibility we need for this moment. So I want to define it really quickly and then just kind of map it out, and then Missy will chat about it. So um, I think of calling as kind of it's two sides of the same coin. It's the invitation of God, and it's also a summons from God. So it's He's inviting us to do something with him in the world, and that's amazing. It's a privilege. It's an honor. But it's really not optional, because he's God. He's the Lord of the universe. And I think of times when I've been invited to do things that are fun or encouraging or brought up to sort of experience things at a different level. There's that element of calling. But I keep a jury summons in my file just to remind me that it really wasn't optional. I had to show up, and there's that side of calling. So God's inviting us into working with him in the world. He's summoning us to it. It's responsibility and privilege. And, Os Guinness is really helpful in getting our heads around calling and in terms of the flexibility that it can create. And that is that Oz says we're called to a who, not a what, at the premier level, the primary level. So we're called into a relationship with Christ. All of us share that, that scriptures use this term, live up to the life worthy of your calling. God has called you to Jesus Christ. And we're called into a relationship, a grace-defined, truth-defined relationship with Jesus, where we actively depend on him for every area of our lives. And that's our primary calling. It's a to whom, not a what. With everything else changing, this is, I think, helpful to remember that we're called into a relationship with God through his son. But then that primary calling plays out into four sort of secondary areas. And the first, I got a little lag on my slideshow here, sorry. But yeah, one is family, one is work, one is church, our spiritual community, and the fourth is to our neighbor. And I don't know about you, but I've found all four of these have changed in the last 2 months. And we can either resent that, or we can lean into it as what God wants for us to do. And I'm going to share an example on the family side, which will seem trite compared to what some of you have been through. Some of you have had to, your kids have come home and you've had to figure out how to juggle 2 careers and multiple children's education study schedules. And I know I have friends and colleagues that's been a challenge for. I have another friend, his father got COVID and actually passed away. And so he has his whole family circle kind of blew up in a hard and tragic way. But for me, my deal is that I'm the cook, and because of income reduction due to COVID, and because of just the practical need to be at home and cook 3 meals a day, I'm cooking all the time and being much more active and helping with the shopping. And to be honest with you, there's been times when that's been hard to do because it feels like I've got so many other things to do. But it's also been helpful to step back from why do I have to do all this, to think, well, God knew, and I have the ability to do this, and my family actually depends on me in this way. And if it's part of my calling, it's part of what God is inviting me and summoning me into, it's not so bad. Actually, I'm finding relief in that. I don't know how each of you process things, but for me, if I can know I'm doing what God wants me to do, it brings me a great deal of relief and confidence. Because if I'm doing what God wants me to do, he's ultimately responsible and I'm not. And that's a huge gift for me. So all of these are changing, but if we have a sense that God has called us into each of these spheres, and the dynamics, then the role is to hear his voice and follow him, as opposed to make it all happen. Missy, what do you think? What's helpful about this?
I think that people feel a lot of pressure. Pre-COVID, people felt a lot of pressure, particularly perhaps in the maybe the white collar, well-educated world, that their calling should be aligned with their passion. And if they're not feeling passionate about it, they maybe have missed their calling. And so I believe that no matter what world you're coming from, this concept of a calling is to Christ. and out of that comes our work, is incredibly encouraging and takes the pressure off of let's just take the next right step for tomorrow. And it reduces this very entitled, very individualism, passion thing.
Yeah, and it's somewhat defined by the needs of our neighbor. Like in a sense, everybody in that all the second tier groups represent neighbors. I mean, your family is in a sense your neighbors. It's a special class. People you work with are neighbors. The people you serve in your work, churches in a special form of neighbors or spiritual brothers and sisters. So, yeah, it's more defined by need. In David Brooks's book Road to Character, he talks about how a lot of times we really can't see what our quote calling is until the right need comes along, and that's a very different. That's like reverse engineering from what you're talking about. Like it's all about me. It's all about what I'm passionate about. And that kind of leads us into our next slide, which has to do with meaning and work. Unless you have further comments you want to say about this, Missy.
Well, I'd love to just tag on to what you just said, which is I really just think it's an inverse of instead of how is my job serving me or lack of having a job serving me, but the other way to think of it is how is what I'm doing part of God's unfolding story for the world? Yeah. And so if I am a janitor, if I am at NASA, if I am a banker, if I am a rental car lease agent, how am I part of God's unfolding story for the world? And I think if I'm unemployed, how am I part of God's unfolding story for the world? So remember, this calling to Christ is our primary calling. Everything else is our secondary calling.
I think it's liberating and it provides flexibility as the world just is upended and we have to reallocate our energy and our focus. And what you're saying really leads us nicely into our next segment, which is about meaning. There we go. The calling provides a sense of meaning, an enduring sense of meaning in your work, no matter what your work is. And I want to walk through this grid quickly, and then we'll process a little bit with you. We're really talking about two things. Where the x-axis, the horizontal, is about how you experience your work, and the y-axis, which is really about meaning, is about how you approach it. It's about the purpose you bring to it. And perhaps a big idea just out of the gate here on this is that we do not derive our meaning from our work. We bring it with us. We bring our purpose with us to our work. We don't derive it from it. And if you're in any kind of high performance culture, which is Western and Asian, and certain parts of Asian culture, where work is everything, then work becomes your sense of meaning. And we're separating that. We're saying we can bring it with us, and this is how we do it. So first of all, just how we experience work, and this is just whether we like it or not, essentially. And when I was a young boy, I was introduced to work because I was given chores. These were things I had to do before I could get to do what I wanted to do. Chores were hard, or they were just not fulfilling. And so I had to clear the table before I could go play. I still remember that. Still scarred from that as a 4-year-old boy. So I still remember that. But there's something else I did when I was a kid that, upon reflection, really looked a lot like work, but I didn't realize it at the time. It didn't feel like work. And I used to like to build tree houses, and they were never going to be on any kind of reality TV show about fancy things that you build for your kids. These were two pieces of, 2 2x4s and a piece of plywood and a tree. It was basically a platform. But the process of building these things, it involved a lot of effort. It involved planning. It involved gathering scrap wood at construction sites around the neighborhood. It involved finding nails and tools and so forth, and sweat and blood, and even probably not tears, but not so great with a hammer sometimes. So lots of bruised thumbs. So it was work, but it didn't feel like work. And it was work that was characterized by what we sometimes call the flow state, where the challenge of you have a rising skill level that meets the challenge and just keeps getting, so we need a sense of challenge, and we need to be able to meet that challenge with our skills. And that's what sometimes we call treehouse work. Most of us have hopefully had an experience at some kind of task, whether it's a paid or not, where the time just flew by. We didn't even need to eat. We were just so immersed in what we were doing that we would call that flow. So that's the experience of work. All work is on this continuum between chore work and treehouse work. And we'll come back and unpack that in a minute. The other side of this is how do we approach our work? And I want to talk about the difference between a secular and a sacred approach to work. So this is really how we frame it. This is how we see it. And, you know, if you're a pastor or in a ministry position, this is what you can provide for people, this different perspective. And all of us as workers, no matter what kind of work we're in, secular or sacred, we still bring a perspective about our work with us. And it may or may not be sacred, actually. So the secular perspective or frame on work is that work is for me and by me. So when I started my career, I had a small business, as Missy mentioned, and I just really wanted to make as much money as I could, as quickly as I could. And it was really for me. It really wasn't for anybody else. I had customers. I wanted to do a decent job so I could get paid and get on to the next customer. It's very transactional. And anybody that got in my way, I got them out of my way. I fired most of my early employees because they didn't live up to my expectations. I ruptured relationships because I worked all the time. So that's a secular approach to work. It's very lonely, actually, because it's all up to me to make it happen, and it's all for me. A sacred approach to work, which gets into some of what you were saying or just a moment ago, Missy, about, you know, work that benefits others. It's work that's for God, with God, and for others. And even a person that doesn't have a faith center can have a sort of sacred approach to work when they stop working just for themselves and they start working for the benefit of other people. And there's lots of studies that show that the most fulfilling and enduring value we find in our work, no matter what our faith perspective, is the positive impact that work has on people. And that's where the endorphins start firing on our side. But as believers, you know, we have an opportunity to not just do our work for other people, we should, for our neighbor, but we also have the opportunity to do our work for God and with God. And sometimes in the faith and work world, Colossians 3:23 is sort of diminished as sort of, you know, baby food, you know, do your work unto the Lord. But I think it's actually a deep and liberating concept that it's not about what you do, it's about who you do it for. And God receives our work as worship, and so we can do it for him. Another thing that we like to talk a lot about at Voca is just that we can also do our work with God. It's not just for him, like this offering to him, but you look at Psalm 127, it talks about the building and the protecting, and it says, unless, you know, the Lord builds a house, we build in vain. Unless the Lord protects the city, we protect in vain. So God is building, we're building. God's protecting, we're protecting. We do these things with him, and that's what makes work sacred. So this nets out. Missy, you're going to say something there, because.
Well, so I want to jump in because I think if you have if you're listening and you've been around the faith work conversation very often, you often hear, "Oh, we're blowing up the sacred secular divide. There is no sacred versus secular work." I think it's important to point out we agree with that. What Chip is highlighting here is this is one's approach to work. So you can have a sacred approach to banking. You can have or running a dry cleaners or working for a grocery store. You can have a secular approach to actually being a pastor of a Christian church.
Absolutely.
So I think we're using the words in a nuanced way here to be, what is the way in which we are approaching the work? All work can be done with a sacred approach.
That's right. And all work in that sense, and then in the broader sense that you were referring to before, all work is technically sacred work when we view it from the perspective of God's plan. But that's not how we're using it today. So this 2x2 nets out to 4 different meanings in our work. When we approach our work from a secular frame and it's chore work, it becomes a grind. It's just a grind. It's just something we have to get through to get to what we want. There's no value in it, and we complain about it all the time. Some of us were probably raised in a family where that's the way work was approached. When we have a secular approach to work and it's treehouse work, in other words, it feels like it's a really good fit. It matches our passion, it's dream job category. Then our work can quickly become a god. It becomes the thing that's more important than anything. It makes us feel powerful. It makes us feel secure. And, I think when I was starting out, that's kind of the way work was for me, at least when it was going well. It was in the God category. When we move above the line from the secular to the sacred, we get two more meanings for work, and these are the ones that we want for each of you, and these are the ones that we think that we can derive from a God-defined sense of calling. Chore work, viewed sacred from a sacred frame, is growth. It's growth for us. It's actually provision for others as well. But it's growth. It's not a waste. It's not a detour in your life. It's not the end of meaning and purpose in your work. It's got purpose. And I think in this COVID moment, when some of us may have to do work we don't want to do, work that we didn't plan on, wasn't part of our career plan. For some of us, our work, as we saw in the poll, our work is actually finding work. And that's what God's calling us to do in our work, to work at finding work. And we can talk more about that. In fact, our third diagram will help us a bit with that. But that may not, it's not what we want to do. And there's aspects of looking for a job that are a chore, for sure. But it's still not a waste. It's something God wants to use to grow us and our character and make us like him. And then when we see our work as for God, with God, and for others, and it matches, it qualifies as treehouse work, that work's a gift. That work becomes a gift. In Ecclesiastes, the phrase is repeated 2 or 3 times that, when you can find enjoyment that the toil God is giving you to do under the sun, when you can find that sense of enjoyment or satisfaction in your work, that is a gift of God. And I think that another thread on this is for the COVID season is to find the little gifts, the times, the little tree houses in our work. Sometimes what we do, I think, is we make this a zero-sum game. My job is a chore job, or my job is a treehouse job. And that's probably not true most of the time. There's probably chore and treehouse elements to all work, and there's probably some things that are kind of in between. But even if you have to do a chore job to survive this time financially, how can you find those treehouse elements of it, which perhaps is an emotional survival strategy more than anything, because both have meaning. But there's probably things about it that actually match who you are, match your wiring, match how God's made you, even though it's not what you aspire to be or do long term. And you can find little kind of morsels of joy in the midst of a larger chore situation with your work. I mean, I had to search for a job. I've done it twice, actually, in the last 10 years. And again, my examples may seem trite compared to some of the things that some of you face. But for me, I hate having to ask for appointments. I hate it. I feel like I'm bothering people. Like, I don't know, maybe I just don't want to be vulnerable. I'm not really sure, but I just don't like asking. But on the flip side, I actually really enjoy conversations with new people. I love meeting people. I just don't like asking for it. And so that, again, it may sound, Chip needs to go see his therapist some more instead of telling us about where the chore and growth treehouse parts are. But it's finding those treehouse points in your work that can really, I think, help us see that God's still giving us those little gifts to keep us going. And particularly for those of us who feel like we're on a career detour right now, there's hope. There's sustaining hope in that. Missy, let's talk about it. What do you think of the grid?
Yeah, I love the grid, and I have a great example of just seeing someone this week who had moved to unemployment. He was in gift work. He's moved to what could be growth or grind, but he's able to see it through growth. And as I say this, I will first qualify that I'm not in New York City, and I know that the lockdown is much tougher in New York City, but I'm in Tennessee right now, and the lockdown is lifting up a bit. And last weekend was hot, and everybody wanted to find a way to get out in the heat, to outside. And there is a canoeing company that will meet you at the river and give you a canoe, and you can go canoeing. And so my family, we decided to meet at the river, and this person would bring us a canoe and we would go canoeing. And I got to talking to the person that brought the canoe to put into the river for us. And he is a music video director. And the music video world is not going very well right now. Nobody's making music videos. And the music video directing job, he's probably 40 years old, is complete flow work. He adores the work. He said there is none and there won't be any for quite a while. So he is now a canoe shuttler. I said, well, how's it going? He said, I thought it'd be really fun that I could just meet people all day and just drive some people to their canoes. And it wouldn't be that big a deal, or drive canoes to the people. He said, it is hard. I'm loading and unloading 60 canoes a day. It's physically hard. It's boring. I don't like it. He said, but I've been able to find all these places along the river for music videos when music video work comes back. These beautiful places on this Tennessee River I didn't know exist. And so he had his gift work. He's having to do what feels like grind, but he's moving his mindset into growth by perceiving. And I don't know if he's a Christian or not, so I don't know if he's gone so far as to make it sacred for God with God, but he's definitely has a perspective that's for others or for something longer term.
And I think that movement from sacred from secular to sacred is one. I mean, that's a spiritual formation piece of this, where you have to immerse yourself in the kinds of practices and truth that are going to reinforce that perspective, because it's really about perspective and motives, your own. And then the movement from chore to treehouse, or at least understanding what a treehouse is. I mean, very simply, you can just look at your energy. What gives you energy, what depletes you, which is very subjective. And when we work with clients to discern kind of their calling, we use a lot more objective tools to help them understand, the talent that would drive them to that would define treehouse work for them. But you start with just some basic questions, and you can get a little bit of a feel on it, and then celebrate those treehouse moments amidst like your friend who's just, oh, that would be a great place for a video, and maybe he's actually writing it down in his field notes, and he's got a plan for the future. That's great. Anything else on this one, Missy?
Let's keep moving. I know that I'm seeing a lot of questions come up in the chat about, okay, but what about the unemployed?
Yeah. This last one, this last picture here has to do with calling, providing us with a sense of, I call it gospel agility, the ability to consistently renegotiate where our vocational calling happens, permeated by the reassuring truths of the gospel. So we call this chart the building blocks of calling, or vocational calling. So it's like, how do I figure out where God wants me to work now? And it always, this is true, it doesn't matter whether COVID's happening or not, it always happens at the intersection of the real you and the real world. And the real you is evolving and growing, hopefully. And the real world is always changing. And the whole process just got dramatically more complex and accelerated in the last several months. But so there we have the real you and the real world. And they're actually building blocks 2 and 3. That's probably freaking some of you sequentialists out, but it's going to be okay. Just trust me. Number 1 is gospel identity, and number 4 is gospel destiny. And I'll just quickly throw in some of the pieces, and then we'll talk about this as well. But the big idea, just before we do, is that we're always in the process of negotiating between who we are, the capacities that God has given us, and where those are needed and valued in the world. That's where they intersect. That's called a job. That's a career, and it's always changing. And before COVID happened, what we see is people are changing jobs more frequently. People are changing careers more frequently. When my cohort at Columbia, we're all executive coach trainees, and most of us were on our 3rd or 4th career, not job, career. Missy, I know you've collected a few careers as well. So like that was already normal. And a lot of what we're seeing is that COVID is just intensifying trends that were already happening. So renegotiating that connection that's the nuts and bolts of job search. And we think that there are 4 things on the you side of the ledger. We like to talk about objectively verified abilities, like how do you know what you're really going to be good at? Really important when you may need to transfer industries, that kind of thing. Skills are the marketable deliverables that you're able to provide for employers. It's kind of like if you are a service provider, what services do you typically provide? What value are you able to bring? We always encourage job seekers to be able to answer this question. How do you make companies or organizations better? Because that's the value that you bring, and all of you have it. And that's really what employers need to know about you. Passion, we define it as sustained interest and energy, not jumping up and down rah-rah because we're in New York and well, there's people in New York that like to define passion as jumping up and down rah-rah, but I just don't happen to be one of them. We think that all of us have gotten excited about things, and that excitement has waned. When we talk about passion, we think of the things that sustain your concern, sustain your interest, sustain your energy over time. And when you define it that way and reflect on it that way, it can be helpful. And then the last thing on the real you side of this is what are your boundaries? What are your geographic limitations, your resume limitations? What are your skill limitations? It's boundaries often comes down to a combination of lines we don't want to cross for faith-driven or values reasons, but it also includes the limits of who we are and what we can do. Because it's not true that you can be whatever you want. I don't know if your parents told you that, but mine did. Mine told me that, and I'm 5'4", and I never got to play in the NBA, and I'm still bitter about that. But anyway, boundaries is an important part of this, and some of us may be facing some more acute boundaries as this crisis kind of drags on. And the other side of this, and from a job search point of view, is talking to people around three questions. What kind of work is a good fit for me? What kind of work has some opportunity legs to it? You don't want to jump onto a shrinking iceberg. And then if this is a job or career that's good for me, how do I get there? That's the question of steps. So this is a lot, but these are all the kind of typical questions we would work a client through if they were trying to discern what job is next for me. And it really actually, we still would ask the same questions during COVID as we would during non-COVID time. We might try and accelerate the real world discovery part so we can find opportunity and go after opportunity. But let's wrap this piece by just talking about the two gospel elements of this, because they're really important. The first is gospel identity, and it gets back to that tendency that we have to define ourselves by what we do instead of who we are. And Tim Keller's said very eloquently that in our culture we have a achieved identity, and the gospel offers us a received identity. At 1 John 3, we are the children of God. God has made us his children. And again, I think that it doesn't mean you don't have to do anything to find a job, but it means that ultimately you are not your own responsibility. You're his responsibility. He's your father, and he's promised to take care of you, and he's promised to define you by something other than what you do. It's who he's made you to be. I think that gives us the ability to go into different, like I say, agility. We can go into a whole different career that we didn't plan on because we're still God's son or daughter, and he's still with us. And it's a center that's defined by the gospel and who we are. And then the gospel destiny is Ephesians 2:10. It says, we are his masterpiece, and he's has good work that he's planned for us in advance to do. And, he's got a plan for how the real you and the real world come together. He's got good work for you to do. And one of the things that we tell people who are searching, and I had to learn in my search too, is that you go into a job search and you're desperate to get a job, especially if you're under economic duress, which is always hanging out there somewhere on the horizon, even if it's not immediate. And it's very easy to become very self-focused in the whole process. And somebody, when I was in the middle of search, told me, it's not just about you. It's about you're meeting all these people that you would never have met before. And Missy, you talk about this in your grid about work disruption, but it's like, how do you love those people that you're meeting with, that you're networking with? And can you get your head around the idea that it's not just about you finding a job for you, that God may have appointments, well, he has these appointments for us, but it's not just about what we're going to get out of it. It's also about what we're going to give to the people that are helping us in our search. And so if we can relax and lean into our gospel identity and gospel destiny, then it gives us the freedom to actually treat that person on the other end of the Zoom coffee who you're networking with like a person, and ask them how they're doing and mean it, and ask them how you can serve them and follow up and mean that too. And I think that there's a freeing, maturing dimension that comes to us from the gospel, and just the promise that we're not in this alone, and that God's going to guide us and take care of us, and he has a plan for that work area of our calling.
So Chip, I've got a question for you. If I was sitting unemployed listening to this right now,
Mhm.
and especially the closer I felt to economic um, trouble, passion and opportunity and fit would feel like luxuries.
Mhm.
I need income coming in. And so how do you balance that? How do you balance this real you, real world versus I've got to pay rent on June 1st?
Well, I would say you still have to do a match between probably skills and abilities and fit and opportunity. You just, you have to do that. Like that's a job. That's how I would define a job. Um, and I use this example recently. So I used to work in construction, and I know how to run a project. So I could probably run a distribution team at Amazon. I could probably do that. Obviously, I'm not doing that. I'm a career coach and I'm teaching and lecturing and all that kind of stuff, but I could do that. Why could I do that? Well, because I could demonstrate from my work history that I have some ability to do that. And because there's an opportunity, there's a need for that, because Amazon and CVS and Walmart are hiring like crazy in their, you know, their delivery divisions of their businesses. So this still actually applies. Now, it doesn't hit the passion button, at least not with capital P. But there again, we get into a way, how can I manage this a little bit? How could I find little things I'm passionate about that could help sustain me through that? Little treehouse elements that I can see as God's gifts, even though it feels like a detour.
Mm, that's a good question. Um, I'm going to pull some questions out from the Q&A. Could you talk about the the job of searching for a job as being a job?
Yeah, I think that helps frame. I think we need to think about it that way. I think we need to think about it if we're out of work. First of all, God was not asleep or on vacation when that happened. He knew that was going to happen. And that raises lots of questions for many of us. And I'm not trying to diminish at all the pain of losing a job or the vulnerability of being in a job search, because I've experienced them both and we walk with people through that all the time. Um, but if you can flip it around again, one of the ideas that I'm trying to convey is that there's a tremendous amount of peace and confidence when we know we're doing what God wants us to do. And so if you've lost a job, what God wants you to do is seek a job. That's the work he's called you to do in that work circle of your calling. And when you approach it as a job, then you avoid some of the mistakes that people make, some of the ways we doom ourselves to fail during job search. Number one is people don't spend enough time on their job search. You know, one of the questions I'll ask a person who's in between assignments, how much time are you spending on your job search? And if it's 8 hours or less a week, I know they're probably not going to do very well. If you've got part-time work or even full-time work that you know is ending, you should be spending 20 to 24 hours a week on your job search. It's a lot, but you need to. And if you're out of work, you should be spending at least 40 hours a week on your job search. I have a friend who runs a support group for people who are in between jobs. They meet at 6:30 every Monday morning because he wants them to get out of bed and you just get out of the rhythm, and it kills you. So part of this is embracing this as well. This is what God's called me to do in my work, and part of it's practical because you want to stay in a work focused rhythm. You want to put in 40 hours a week. It's going to take longer. Like generally speaking, in a contracting economy, lots of companies are on hold with their hiring, and others are just letting people go. So it's generally, rule of thumb, it's going to take longer to find a job. So the less time you spend on it, the less you look at it, job seeking as a job, you're just stretching out your time horizon.
Rosewin in Nashville asks us, how do you think about passion versus mission? Is one better than the other in thinking of what to pursue?
I would say that in some ways, all four things on the you side of this, and hello, Rosewin, good to have you with us, by the way. But all four things on the left side there really kind of inform our sense of mission or broader purpose. The tricky thing to me about passion is it changes. And so, I mean, and all of us have been very passionate or enthusiastic about something that ended up being terrible. And I'm not saying just necessarily with a career, but it's just not necessarily, it's a very subjective guide. And that's why we don't put it as the foundation. You know, your talent is something that we think actually doesn't really change. And you can develop it and accentuate it with skills, but it's a it's a it's a better foundation.
Mm. It's interesting. We have another question about interest in our sustained interests, and what if we lose interest in those? And I love how you talk about developing passions. I know you and I have worked together with an article um, that was in the Gospel Coalition a while back on should people set passion as a job search criteria. And I actually looked at all this research that Yale and Singapore University had done, and they actually showed that if you put that as your primary job search criteria, you actually are less likely to be happy, if this is part of the kind of individualism happy project of the West,
Yeah.
in the end, for a variety of reasons. And one is that when you monetize an interest, you often then lose interest in it.
Yeah.
And that's shown in social science. And then a second thing that was shown in social science is things that you're interested in perhaps don't lead to the skills and abilities to make you good at that as a profession. So for instance, I have a niece that's incredibly interested in the preparation of food. She makes the most beautiful, she has a Instagram about it. She's the most beautifully presented foods, but she perhaps is not wired correctly to run a restaurant. Mm-hmm. And so if she tried to run a restaurant, she may actually get super frustrated and lose her interest in food. So someone put in the QA, should some things stay hobbies? Perhaps yes, some things should stay hobbies.
Yeah, and I mean, COVID may not give us that choice. We may have to pick some things that we think are, quote, less than aligned with our passions because there's opportunity there that we have skills for. But I think that's a great point. I had one of our daughters, you know, she was into horseback riding, and it's not a monetized example, but once she got into competition, she didn't like it anymore because that's really changed what it was about. And she liked to ride horses, but she didn't really like to compete. And it's the same idea. It's the same idea there, I think, Missy, that, you know, the other thing, this whole idea of do what you love was started apparently by Steve Jobs. He said it at a Stanford commencement in 2005. And there's an interesting article in Inc. magazine that said Steve is lying because he didn't start out doing what he loved. He was completely lost. He tried all these things, and he discovered that he had a knack for anticipating consumers' appetite for specific technology and driving a team, and literally driving, because he wasn't very nice, but driving a team to create that technology. And then he grew to love it over time. And so the Inc. article basically said, it actually starts with, you're going to enjoy over the long term things that you really have an aptitude to do well, and not just what you think you enjoy at the front end. And I actually take it a step further, though. I'd say that's it, we don't need to worry about it. I mean, we just need what needs done. You know, we just need, especially in a time like this, what is God placing before us that needs done, that we have a capacity to do? We should just lean into that. And I think it's like friendship, it's like happiness. A lot of times, it's a byproduct of, you know, friendship is a byproduct of traveling with people that are headed to the same destination as you are. Happiness is a byproduct of doing things that are worthwhile and engaging. And when we go right after those two things, we often end up with losing on all counts.
So what advice would you give to job searchers needing to community? And what advice would you give to churches to help job searchers?
Well, let's start with the churches first. I think churches can create groups for job seekers where they should be early. I mean, my friends is early in the morning. It's not a gripe session. I mean, there's space for people to talk about how hard it is, and that's important. Place to mourn. We mourn with those who mourn, and we rejoice with those who rejoice. So there's got to be places for mourning in all of this. I don't want any of this to sound like we're discounting the loss that we've all of us have experienced in one way or another in this season. But churches can create groups like that that are real biblical community is going to be, we make a place for that, the emotional reality, but we also hold each other kind of accountable, hopefully not in a draconian kind of way, but for like moving forward with pursuing what God has for us. So and you can do it virtually, so it doesn't really matter, people are all over your city or whatever. You just have you just do it. You create a group where the people can get together, and then you, as a church, you need to remind, it's the place for the church to remind everybody about the value and dignity of all work, and that if we approach it from a sacred frame, it has meaning, because it's a different narrative than we're going to get in our culture. I think, for the job seeker who needs community, one of the big things about being a job seeker, and I think one of the things that just stinks about it, is that you need other people to help you, and that you do not find a job without the help of other people. And that's how God helps us through it. Usually you need people to talk to, you need support. And one of the things that we encourage our clients to do, our Christian clients, is we encourage them to form a prayer team who they text the play-by-play to, not the typical safe like community group share, oh yeah, I'm looking for a job, but I mean, like, I'm really down today, my search isn't getting anywhere, or I have an interview, or I'm seeking information from this. Like, really live out the discipline of depending on God by having others pray for you and the granular details of your search. I feel like I have a friend, he's in tech sales. He loses a job every 2 years because his company gets bought, and it's just the way it is. But we get the text when it starts to go south, and then he texts us all the way through, and we pray him through the whole process. And it's good for all of us. There's like 3 or 4 of us who are his friends, and we're on that thread. But you can do it. And it gets you, as a job seeker, it just gets you accustomed to asking for help. And too many of us say no before asking. We say no for the people in our orbit that God's given us to lean on, and we say no for them without asking. And we're really missing, I think, a resource that God has actually provided.
That's great, Chip. Speaking of resources, I'm seeing some questions come up in the Q&A about how somebody should spend their time looking for a job. And I'll let you all know that we're sending you after this a gift from Chip, which is a 12-page job search guide that will give you lots of steps about looking for a job. It's a job search guide. But another question is coming in about the numbers: abilities, skills, passion, boundaries, 1 through 4. Is there intentionality that those are ranked in order of importance? What is your thought process behind the numbers?
Yeah, we put abilities as number 1 because we think that to build a sustainable vocational track, it needs to be built on the things that you are wired to do well. And that's what we mean by abilities. We use the same term, talent, things you're /born/raised with. Skills of what are ways you've turned those abilities into sort of marketable deliverables. And maybe, the only thing I would say on that, to clarify, maybe boundaries really shouldn't be number 4. Maybe boundaries is really a box around the other 3. Because, we certainly wouldn't say, like, if you have a certain values, like there's just certain, like I had a friend who was in advertising and he left a certain company because they really exploited women. And like, I wouldn't say, well, that's number 4 on your priorities list, that value. Actually, that boundary is literally a border around what you're not going to cross. So maybe the other 3 would fit inside that. And so boundaries being number 4 isn't perhaps the best way to represent it. But the idea of abilities being first really is, that's very intentional, because we think that's the foundation upon which you build your work. And it's all of us have multiple abilities, and in a world where work is being disrupted, we may have to draw on some abilities that we haven't used in our work to get through this season. So we think it's very, very foundational, and we think it can be objectively measured and verified.
That's interesting. All right. So what would you say as the 3 things the unemployed person should be focused on over the next 2 weeks?
Well, and it's in the paper that we're we're providing, but there's really three parts of job search. One is to be prepared, the other is to actively search, and the last part is to land your next. And you know, if you've already been in sort of running hard, you know, we sometimes when the sky falls, we scramble. You probably need to step back and think about some of the preparation pieces of job search. Do I have a sort of a emotional and spiritual support and perspective, because it's going to probably take a while? And you know, who's praying for me? How am I ingesting truth in a way that's going to really change my perspective? A lot of times I ask people, how much time do you have financially to search for a job? And they don't know the answer to that question. And getting your own finances in order, which is actually the topic of our webinar on tomorrow night. So, but having your financial house in order, even if it's, even it's a tent, you know, it's a tiny finances, it's a tent, is really a key to knowing where you are and what you need. And it actually can bring a lot of relief, even if the news isn't great, you know. So preparation is one. Take a step back and prepare. The second thing is that when it comes to searching, a lot of folks just rush ahead and just start applying for jobs. Maybe you know it's something, there's some things that are popping in your world and you know you can do them, and you just need to work, and maybe that's fine. But we really urge people to slow down, even just for a little while, and do what are called information interviews. So you ask people you know, or people you need to know, what their opinion is about opportunity, about where opportunity is, where needs are, what's needed. It's so much, when you ask me for my opinion, it's so much easier for me to answer that question than when you ask me to help you find a job. And so we think you're going to get more traction, and you're going to get more of that knowledge of the real world. And so I would be thinking about next 2 weeks, who can I talk to who has just a good lay of the land that I'm interested in or need to be in terms of my career. So preparation, information interviews. And then I guess the third thing, Missy, I think this is really important. Be really clear on how you make organizations better. How do you make the places you work better? Because what happens when we get into job search mode is we focus on our problem, which is that we need a job. But if I'm the hiring manager, your need of a job is not my problem. My problem is I need somebody that can deliver certain kinds of skills or solve a problem here at my company. And that's my problem. So when you're the job seeker, you need to switch your mindset to become a solution provider for potential employers. We all know you need a job. Everybody's going to give you lots of grace in the sense that you lost your job because of COVID. It's not going to require a lot of explanation. That's great. But don't talk about your sad story about losing your job with a potential employer. Talk about that with your spiritual support group. Bring your value. Be very clear on the value you can bring. Tailor it to the needs of the position or the company. I think, and that just requires maybe some conversations with some other people to help you articulate that and say it succinctly. But it's a big switch, and something we have to work with clients on all the time is, you know, that hiring manager, she has a problem to solve. That's why there's a position created, and you need to present yourself as the solution to her problem, not look at her as a solution to your problem, that you need a job or you need to work from home, or you need every other weekend, you never have Friday off. That's not her problem. Her problem is, we really need we're blowing up because our online orders are going through the roof, and we need somebody reliable that we can count on, that's going to keep everybody rowing in the same direction. I don't know, I'm just making that up, but it's really a mindset shift that most of us need to make when we're in job search mode.
So I'll close on that note with somebody has asked for some other resources. I recommend a few resources. I recommend a book called The Call by Os Guinness. The Call by Os Guinness. That will really help you philosophically think about our calling to Christ as our primary calling, and our calling to our jobs as our secondary calling. I recommend Every Good Endeavor by Catherine Alsdorf and Tim Keller, which will help you understand the basics of faith and work, no matter your industry. And I also want to let you know that we will be sending you a 12-page job search guide courtesy of Voca Center, CHIP's organization. And if you would like to be part of any other job search mailings, please feel free to sign up at the link provided. And we also today will be sending you the slides from this webinar as well as the webinar video. And we do recognize there was a link problem and several of you arrived late, so you will be able to watch the part of the video that you missed. So we thank you for attending today and have a wonderful day.